Brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
I'm a little bit nervous about this one because I'm a theologian, but I'm not a Bible scholar. They're different things.
Well, neither am I. And this is, this particular text has only become kind of popular. I guess it's kind of hipster popularized. David just did a search on it recently, but it's Apocrypha, and it's not biblical, like it's not New Testament, it's Old Testament Apocrypha. It's a part of the mystics' writings, but the reason why I decided to go to this text is because I don't even want to look at it necessarily as Apocrypha. I want to look at it as a potential, very compelling story of how Judaism happened. And plus, it's kind of a light topic. I find it interesting, and it's a good way back in.
The midrashes for that they have fuller explanations of the stories in the Old Testament.
Right.
There's two main ones. Is when they went to Babylon, there's a set, and there was a set that was written while they were still in Jerusalem. So there are two sets of midrashes that differ slightly, but they have similar themes.
Yeah, this is at the sunset of the whole apocalyptic movement and tendencies. But I want to look at this text less in a theological kind of point of view and more in a, I don't know, kind of feasible, like I said, a feasible explanation that was written by people much before present time who probably had a better idea what was going on even before their time, but better window into the mentality of people. I just find the story particularly compelling out of all the...
Yeah, I know a lot of people discounted any religious writings as actual history, but it turns out it's more and more and more people are seeing it. It is actual history, even though it's not written in the way historians would write nowadays.
Right, it's cultural and ethnographic history, if nothing else. And it's interesting, when I was preparing for this episode, I was looking for images of actually Judaic, early Judaic idols, because I know that, I follow some Israeli archaeologists, and I know they find regularly various statues and idols of gods and statuettes and big statues, obviously, because those peoples, like any other peoples, had multiple waves of migrations and my religions and everything else, but I cannot find hardly any images on the internet of specifically, Israeli finds of early pre-Judaic figurines or idols, and it's kind of interesting. I even asked my friend who lives in Jerusalem to do a search, and he was able to find a bunch of Slavic, Celtic, you name it.
They're kind of against idols back then, so
yeah. Even though they're well known, they're in museums, they're openly. It's not some big fat archaeologists hiding from the people. Well, what's funny is that the Jewish archaeologists, this information, I'm getting it from an actual Israeli archaeologist. Well, he's not an archaeologist. He's actually a Hebrewist. He's somebody who specializes in studying, ancient Hebrew and various Semitic texts. But he's the one who's bringing this to light and saying this is interesting, this is part of our history, but it's interesting how Google, I guess people don't search for that a lot, so it kind of gets dropped at the bottom of the results. So yeah,
that would be good, because there are words in the Bible that we don't know how to translate from the original Hebrew because nobody knows what the words mean.
Right. And actually, we're going to run into one of these. Okay, guys, so it's 5 after, so we're going to go ahead and start. I believe we are on episode 59. My counting has gotten a little funny as of late. So I decided to take a break from discussing China, which for me is a very laborious exploration because it is such a important and complex and novel for me subject, and I decided to kind of take a break into discussing something simple and easy like the early Semitic history, just a simple subject. And I came across this piece of literature, and it has 2 titles really. It's known as the Revelation from Abraham, but it's also known as the Apocalypse of Abraham. The funny part is that those 2 words mean the exact same thing. The only reason today apocalypse to most Christians means something that has to do with the end of times and, the sky's coming down and final judgment is because the only apocalyptical writing that actually wound up being included in the canonical texts that both Judaic and Christian traditions follow is the one that specifically has to do with the end of times. But when in fact a lot of apocalyptic writings actually had to do with how things began and not how they're going to end. So there's an interesting history to this particular text. I want to say that I got this material from Eshkolot. It's a YouTube channel. They also do it in English, some lectures in English, a lot of lectures in Russian, because as we know, there's a lot of diverse, some in French for that matter. So these are scholars who study in depth various aspects of Jewish history, culture, archaeology, everything from modern day, to the Holocaust, to Soviet Union times, to really archaic times, to archaeological finds. So these are people who are very knowledgeable and very trustworthy as far as that particular subject goes, because this is internal Israeli forum of scientists and researchers and participants. And it's called Eshkolot. And the particular researcher that I'm going to be leaning on heavily here is Michael Wogman. And he is Russian, and he speaks Russian and Hebrew, and he is specialist in Hebrewist. He's a Hebrewist, or somebody who specializes in ancient Hebrew texts. But this particular text is an interesting text because it comes at the junction on the one hand of the Hebraistic studies, and on the other hand, the Slavic studies, the Slavistic studies, because no actual Semitic language text survives of this particular story, of this particular book. And when I say book, by the way, guys, I'm just going to give you up front. In Russian Bible, what you guys call chapters, we call books. So if I kind of mix that up, sometimes I apologize in advance, but I'm going to use those interchangeably. I'm going to try to stick to using the word chapters, but mostly we're going to be talking about Genesis here. We're going to be talking about the Old Testament, and we're of course talking about chapters, not books. The only surviving texts of this particular chapter are in actually archaic Slavic language. And it is obvious that this is a direct translation from not surviving Greek text that in itself in turn is a translation most likely from Aramaic, which in turn is a translation from an early Semitic language, most likely some version of Hebrew, but that's kind of debated. And there's proof to the fact that this is not just something that, let's say, just the Russian scholars or the early Bulgarian scholars wrote down, or even the Greek scholars invented. There are hints in the text that allow us to date it and allow us to believe that there was an actual original that this was translated from. But this text dates to about 2,000 years ago, and that would have been when the Aramaic text was constructed. And there's a context to it. It's a translation of a translation. Like I said, Aramaic to Greek to Slavic. The original is lost, but there are referrals to it. There are hints that this text did exist and that was known to the old-time Jewish population. Couple of things. First of all, there's later mentions in certain Slavic writings, certain Slavic chronicles, where, for example, Arakum, who is a very well-known active character in the history of the early Russian Slavic Russian Orthodox Church, refers to these texts. But there's also parallels between this particular narrative and the Hebrew fairy tales. Now, Hebrew fairy tales is folk fairy tales, pretty old stuff. There's also hints and mentions of this text, referrals to it. For example, Jesus of Navarre mentions kind of in some of his quoted text, he refers to this particular story. So this is obviously a narrative that was well known to the peoples around the turn, from BC to AD, right around the time of the destruction of the temple. People in that area, people who were Judaic, they knew this text, they knew this narrative. It was something that was very much a part of their understanding of reality. And it serves a very interesting purpose, and we will talk about what purpose it serves at the end if we have time. But this comes from what is known the mystical or the mythical Judaism. This particular wave that was happening they thinking around 70 AD. It followed very shortly after the destruction of the temple, but before the Romans killed off all the mystic Judaic writers and philosophers, or they very rapidly converted to more mainstream Hellenistic version of Judaism. Bottom line is it was right at that very volatile time when the old diversity of various movements and various different outlooks within Judaic, basically society, still existed, to where it was curbed. And a lot of these texts, what unites them, they're known as the apocalyptic texts. They mention in one way or another, they refer to the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem, which is of course a very traumatic and very central event in to this day in the memory of the Jewish people. The oldest Russian copy that we know of is 14th century, or at least the one that I'm going to be referring to here. This is a group, again, this is a part of the text that are known as Apocrypha, and these are the texts that throughout multiple historical, social, religious, and various other political factors got excluded, not only from the final rendition of the Bible, of the New Testament, but they also got excluded from the Judaic tradition. Now, in the Christian tradition, there was intentional kind of censorship and cleansings of certain texts. Some texts got not just got lost due to fires or wars, but for example, it's known that in the Byzantine Empire, certain texts that were considered to be not a part of the canonical text were actually destroyed on purpose. Now, in the Judaic society, that was a little bit less organized. So some of these texts kind of sort of, not this particular one, kind of sort of survived on the outskirts. But where we find these kind of fragments of these texts that obviously belong to the original Judaic tradition, but are lost today to the mainstream, are right around the outskirts of what was the Judeo-Christian world at the time. We're talking about Ethiopia, we're talking about other parts of Africa, we're talking, for example, about certain parts of the Middle East, more kind of remote places, and of course, we're talking about Slavic world, where through the Byzantine Empire, some of these texts got translated and went to the barbarians in the Far East, and where some of these stories got preserved and kind of passed on by the church, not only just church people who were intellectuals involved in, but also among the common folks, as oftentimes people turn Holy Scripture into kind of fairy tales or parables for their kids. So these texts, these narratives, they survived. And again, they survived an actual Judaic tradition as part of the fairy tales, but not the canonical religious texts. Am I on cue so far, Chris?
Yeah, I would argue parts of it, but that's a basic idea.
Right, and I'm just trying to give a very basic background. I mean, I don't want to get into much. The reason, and I was saying earlier, the reason why I chose this particular text, and I only chose the first part of it that I really want to talk about, I don't want to get into the biblical discussion of what happened and what is the secret of meaning, because a lot of these texts are very complex, they're very layered, and I understand why people get buried in discussing these texts, because they're so complex sometimes that it's difficult to looking at those texts from the distance of our time, the distance of the, not just time, but space. It's hard to put yourself in the mind frame of the people who were originally writing it, who themselves took another tradition that they were basing their writing on, and what audiences were interpreting, what they were hearing, because oftentimes these were read and not actually written. I mean, a lot of the people who were exposed to these texts, they heard them, they didn't read them in any sort of written form. And so it's hard to understand all the different layers of meanings, not only intended to be in those texts, but then got layered on top of them as the time went on, and different audiences and different scholars got exposed to them or participated in them.
All with their own prejudice.
Yeah, always their own prejudice, always their own economical, political, various national, just situational problems. Another feature, so one feature of these texts is that they oftentimes are kind of written from the first person. So in other words, it seems that a biblical character is speaking directly to the listener, to the reader. And there are a lot of these known for the Old Testament. For example, there's one from Noah that was lost. There's one that survives in Ethiopia that is supposedly first-person text of the angel who actually spoke to Moses up on the mountain. And so it tells the story of what happened and what he said to Moses and what he gave to Moses, not from Moses' perspective, but from the perspective of the angel itself, which is an interesting turn. A lot of these are commentary to existing texts, but the scholars who wrote that commentary, and they were usually collectives of scholars, they wrote them in such a way to not bore necessarily their reader to death with the idea of, we think what this book of the Bible, of the Holy Scripture says means blah, blah, blah. No, instead they kind of filled in the blanks, of kind of wrote their commentary and explanations as narratives.
I was just going to say that in theology, we define an apocalypse as something that's very symbolic. And so like that, a lot of modern Christians read the book of Revelation and get it wrong because they're literal. And it's never meant to be literal. And the apocalypses are quite often written by people in times of trouble, and they don't want the authorities to come at them for what they've written. So they write things that the intended readers would understand, but the authorities wouldn't, and that way they stay safe. So reading them it's quite difficult to interpret them these days, because you have to put yourself in the mind of the people that were writing it. And of course, having been translated a few times, there's a few minds you've got to go through.
Well, not to mention the various metaphors and allusions and, phraseology. And another thing is a lot of these texts really, I mean, like you said, yes, some of them were directed at the troubled times, but a lot of them were really looking towards the past, not the future. Some of the apocalyptic writings was about the future or the present, but a lot of them were looking at the past. They were trying to rethink, reevaluate, re-explain some very long ago events. And this one is going to be this part that I want to talk about today is not only going to be super easy to interpret, it's pretty darn easy. It's also going to be kind of amusing, which is not what you can say about a lot of these very traditional texts. And and it is believed that it was intended to be written in an amusing, very simple, very kind of goofy manner, which is one thing that I really like about it. This text consists of 3 parts. The first part is what we're going to talk about, and it's a simple narrative. It's just a story. The second part becomes a little bit less simple narrative and a lot more psychedelic. And then the third part gets much more, not even psychedelic. It's really more of it's one of those texts that really brings up the idea of theodicea before theodicea in Christianity was really approached. And that's the idea of how come there's bad things happening on earth if God is supposed to be all knowing and all wise and in control of everything. And that's a really whole separate dialogue, which ends really kind of, to me, very strangely. And actually to a lot of readers of that text ends very strangely. And they believe that's why it was excluded from the canonical texts. But the first part is simply a story. And it is the story of our hero, Abraham. Now, those of us who have read the Old Testament, we know that there is an interesting jump. Oftentimes the Bible does these jumps between sections. For example, in the chapter 11, we have this long, basically lineage, the long genealogy of he begot him, begot this, begot that person, they lived this long, they lived this long. It's a list, right? And that chapter ends, and then we go to chapter 12, and the Lord spoke unto Abraham. And there's no reason, no explanation as to why did the Lord speak to Abraham. Why did the Lord not speak to, I don't know, somebody else, Abraham's brother, Abraham's neighbor, his father, his son? And there's no real explanation in either the Judaic version or in the Christian version. It just, for whatever reason, the Lord speaks to Abraham. Well, here's a story that strives to fill in that gap, strives to explain to us why was Abraham special and how did he come to be. And the Russian title, well, the Slavic, the Proto-Slavic, the Church Slavic title of this particular book is, it opens up with a phrase that people have debates about what that word means. One of the suggested translations would be the day that I wrecked my father's gods. That's like the intro phrase. And the word that is used specifically is it's a archaic Slavic word that is hard to translate, that we don't really find a parallel for, but really, I mean, it sounds something very similar to destroyed, accidentally broke, made a mess of, inappropriately treated. In other words, it kind of, to me, conveys the idea of not intentional, how I destroyed or how I cast aside. It's more like, oopsie-dent, I did bad things to my father's gods. Here goes the little narrative. This is the part that I really enjoy. So we have Abraham. Now, Abraham's age is not defined. In the fairy tales, he's described as a child, as a boy. And you will see in the narrative that a lot of his actions are kind, and his role is a lot like childlike. But then again, his father is also portrayed as a very simple, not very complex man. So says Abraham, it was my day to tend to my father's gods. And so I went to the place of worship, and I went there to tend to the gods. And when I entered the space, I saw something that really, really, made me very worried, made me very concerned, made my heart troubled. So what did he see? Well, what he saw is there's multiple statues standing in this particular chapel, whatever you want to call it. Some are made of stone, some are made of wood, some are made of some sorts of metal, some are bigger, some are smaller, different gods, right? And he sees that the god, Maru Maha, is laying face down at the feet of another god. And the other god is known as Nahon. And this really upsets our character. Why does it upset him? Well, because, the god that fell down at the feet of the other god is supposed to pretty much be the supreme god of their pantheon. And so what does this mean? How did this god fall down? Why is our supreme god lying face down at the feet of another god, kissing his feet, thus really worries Abraham. And so Abraham tries to put the god back, right? The god is made out of stone. It's a heavy god. It's a heavy statue. And so he runs out. He says, Dad, Father, horrible things have happened. God, our God has fallen. Our supreme God has fallen. What do we do? Well, his father says, Sonny, don't worry. We're going to go and put the God back. So they go back into the chapel. They try to put the stone god back. And as they're lifting the stone god, Abraham is holding the head. His father is holding the body. And the head falls right off the body and is left in Abraham's hands. So now he's looking at the head. His father's got the body is crumbling, the statue obviously broke. And Abraham says, oh my gosh, Father, what have we done? Our God has cracked, it's broken. So his father says, don't worry about it, son, run back to the house, bring me my tools, and I'll fix God up. So Abraham runs, brings the tools, and the father starts working on the statue. He fixes the statue, they attach the head, they stand up the God. And at that time, Abraham has this thought, he's like, how come our supreme God fell on his face and wasn't able to get up? That's a little concerning. Well, the day continues on. Now, all these events in the story are happening in one day. And the father, whose name is, in some versions is Far, and in other versions is how do you pronounce his name, Chris, in English? Because there's, Far is the original pronunciation. And there's a little interesting thing with that in the different texts. But there's also Tara, isn't it? How do you pronounce Abraham's father's name?
I don't actually know, to be honest.
You know what? I have the Bible with me, so I'm going to tell you.
But I know Abraham's name was Abram back then, and it didn't get the Ham part at the end for a while. But I don't know his dad's name.
Yep, no, I'm going to pull it up because it's listed right at...
A-R-R.
Yeah, but there's the Greek. Well, here's the thing. There's different ways of spelling it. We have the modern, obviously English version of saying it. There's also was the Greek pronunciation, and there's also the archaic Thera. So in Greek, it would have been Thera. Terra is how we write it modernly. Now, in Russian language, on ancient Slavic, the way you pronounce the canonically write the same name is Far. What's interesting in this text, just going back to the authenticity of the text, is the fact that the scribe who was obviously transcribing this from a different translation, at first he didn't know what character he was talking about, so he was writing Thera, and then he realized that this was the character that was already known in the canonical text, and then he switched to the proper Russian transcription of the word, and from that point on was uniform in his naming of the father of Abraham. But the original word that is actually written in the Slavic text is Semitic version of pronunciation. Am I making sense? And that's one of the things that points to the fact that this is not something that people invented later on. This is actual translation of a translation. It's one of the things that makes this text authentic. Well, anyway, so the father tells Abraham, says, Abraham, I have these God statues that I made. I need you to take them to the market and sell them. And that's when we find out that Abraham doesn't come from any family, that Abraham's father is actually a sculptor. He's a craftsman, and he makes idols. He makes various statues of various gods, and that's what he does for a living, which is kind of an important point. And so Abraham gets on his cart, and he's got 5 of these god statues that his father had made. He's on his way to the market, and some say maybe Assyrian, some of them say maybe there was something else, but bottom line is some merchants of a different tribe come riding the opposite direction, and their camel starts making noise and scares the heck out of Abraham's donkey. Now the donkey gets startled, the donkey runs, the car gets turned over, the statues fall out, and 3 out of the 5 break into pieces. And Abraham is sitting there going, oh my goodness, how am I going to tell my father this? I was supposed to bring back money. I'm in trouble. What am I going to do? And the merchants, being nice merchants and knowing that their camel was the one who was the culprit for this disaster, they say, look, how about we just buy the 2 remaining statues from you, since they're whole and they're gods and we're God-fearing people, and at least compensate you for this trouble. And Abraham says, okay, and he names the price for the 2 statues, and of course the price is full 5. So the merchants pay him, he sells the 2 remaining figures, they're big, and now he has all these broken gods left. And so what does he do? Well, he doesn't want to go home and tell his father that he broke his father's work. So he goes to a nearby river and he dumps the broken statues into the river. And as he is standing there and watching them sink underwater, he thinks to himself, this is a little strange. How come these gods disappear under the waves? Why won't they come up from under the waves? Why won't they punish me? Why won't they punish the merchants? Why won't they punish the donkey? And how come, wait a minute, my dad made these gods. So these gods are my dad's creation. So wait, does that mean my dad is a god? And should they not be praying to him instead since he made them? So he kind of has these kind of almost very childlike thoughts in his mind. Well, he comes back home to his father, and his father says, son, you need to make some dinner. Go gather some firewood, start a fire, make us some food. Being an obedient son, Abraham goes about and he's gathering firewood. And he finds among somewhere nearby bushes, he finds a little wooden statuette of an unknown to him God. It's not very big. A wood statue of a God, and the wood statue of the God has a written text on it. It's not a God that his people worship, but it is basically the name of the God means I am the Lord of fire. So Abraham says, okay, he puts together his little fire pit, he gets his fire going, he sets the little statue of the God on the side, and then he says, God, you're the fire God, watch over my fire, and so it doesn't go out, because I need to go ask my dad about what am I supposed to do as far as dinner, what he wants to eat. The fire starts going out, you, the fire God, you better blow on it or whatever, to do whatever to rekindle this fire. And he goes out, he asks his dad, what do you want for dinner? He comes back, and lo and behold, there lays the statue with its head in the fire. And Abraham stands there and he looks at the statue, scratches his head and says, well, weren't you keen on lighting, keeping the fire going? I mean, you must have really been intent on blowing and rekindling this fire, and you kept it going. And while he's sitting there and scratching his head and thinking all this, the text literally says that a big fire engulfed the statue and it burned prettily until it turned into nothing but ash and burnt up altogether. So Abraham thinks to himself, strange gods we have here. And he's kind of amused at this point in time. His faith in gods is starting to go a little funny. Well, his father, his good old trusting father, comes to the place where they're eating, and Abraham, being playful, tells him, Father, you should be very grateful to this God that I found. Let me find the name of him. Yeah, Varisat. Varisat is the God's name, Varisat. And it's kind of possibly is translated as the son of fire, or the God who is over fire. His father says, oh, praise be to our, whatever the head God is, for bringing us this food and this fire. And Abraham loves, he says, Father, you're thinking the wrong God. It was the God Varisat that made sure that you had good fire and you have this dinner tonight. And his father says, well, how so? And Abraham explains to him, he says, well, I found the statuette of this God and I put it on the side of the fire. The God fell and with his own body basically cooked your dinner. Oh, great praise be to the great God Varisat, says Abraham at this point in time. I need to make sure to make another little statuette by tomorrow, so tomorrow he can also rekindle my fire. And at this point in time, Abraham goes, okay, he's annoyed, and he goes into the preaching pose, and he says, oh, Father, foolish is thou, right? How can you believe in all these spirits for, it's the basic, the kind of repetitive monotheistic argument of, water can put out fire, a fire can burn, some wood, basically all these entities that you worship, they're nothing, they're all kind of finite, they're all very limited. There must be an unknown great someone, there might be an unknown great creator, and that is the true God, that is the true Lord, that is the true entity that created us all, and that's whom we should be worshiping rather than trying to spend our time on all these little other creatures. And that's when the story changes its tone, because up until this point in time, we had a pretty kind of fun, kind of warm-hearted, good-natured, familiar story. You have the father, you have the son, other family members. And when Abraham gets done with his fiery speech, Abraham hears a voice in his head, and the voice says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham, as he is known to do, says, I am here. And the voice in his head says, I am that great creator, the great unknown force that you have been looking for. And you're the only one who recognized my existence. And at this point in time, he says a phrase with which another chapter in Genesis starts, which without this connecting story doesn't make a lot of sense. But the phrase is now, go forth from your father's house. In other words, in the context of this story, it doesn't just mean leave the unfaithful people on the tribe of your father and go forth. No, it literally says like, get out of your father's house now, go right now, out, go. And Abraham grabs his robes and he starts running out, and lightning strikes his father's house and everybody dies. And Abraham is standing there looking at the, and they even describe the damage done by this lightning strike, or whatever you want to call it, sudden fire from the sky. They say it's 40 cubits deep and wide. And another phrase that you should be very familiar with, Chris, it's very much from the canon of the Old Testament, when the Lord says, "Do not fear me, for I am not here to punish you. I'm here to guide you and to be, basically to be your to be your helper and to be your guide." And that's where the whole story moves on to the second, a little bit more complex, a lot more psychedelic part that also in a way connects to some of the other chapters in the canon as we know it, because at that point in time, all the other interesting stories that are included in our canonical stories are excluded. And from that point on, literally, Abraham sees an angel, the angel takes Abraham to the top of the mountain, and Abraham performs very strange rituals, which are mentioned in the canonical story, but are not explained, when he takes different animals, chops them up into halves, and arranges them in interesting and unusual patterns, which is kind of not something that's really described as a part of the ritual up until that point in time, or since. And the way that this is explained, and that goes back to the book of Enoch, is that that is the way that he's being demonstrated, the way that the universe is made. In other words, these kind of dismembered animals are kind of a three-dimensional diagram of the universe. And then a lot of other
tradition of passing between the like an animal's split in half and you pass in between it like two people, and that seals a contract. That's an example of this is a thing that was done back then.
Right, but usually not multiple animals in weird arrangements, because this kind of goes, the angel specifically tells him, put this animal here and it represents this, put this animal there, it represents that. And they go through this whole ritual, and as a result of that ritual, Abraham rises up and goes up and meets a very interesting angel, which to me is probably my favorite angel of all times, and it's the angel who is specifically responsible of making sure that in the heavenly chariot, you know how they have the four-headed steeds, or whatever you want to call them, the mounts, the creatures that carry the chariot, they all have four animal heads. Well, this angel's job is to make sure that the right animal heads are facing each other, because if the wrong ones are, they start fighting each other, and that's not very efficient as far as transportation goes. But it goes into that whole idea of kind of complex angelology and mythical symbolism and all that other stuff. But what I want to kind of stop at here is, I think that story, even though it was written at the turn of basically from BC to AD, I think it's a fairly compelling reconstructed narrative on how somebody may have suddenly gone from a world which is utterly polytheistic, or if not shamanistic in some cases, to suddenly and utterly being monotheistic. Yes, it's a reconstructed narrative, but to me, it's a very compelling narrative. And I can see where the simple people who would have been listening to that story back in that 70 AD or even after, found it very believable. it is a very feasible explanation. You have a father whose job is to make idols, right? And somebody who's observing this day in and day out may grow particularly not very reverent towards these gods, right? And decide that maybe these gods are a bunch of fluff and should not really be treated with respect. And I kind of want to know what you guys think about that particular take on the story.
Well, it's sort of interesting when you think what Abraham actually lived would have been like, I think it's 2500 or 3000 BC. I have to look it up, but somewhere around there. So this story is written well after Abraham's time, right, to explain how monotheism became a thing, which is, it's a story to explain that, I guess, but it's interesting.
Well, and I just find it fairly compelling construct. I assume that the scholars who wrote down the text are not the ones who came up with the explanation. Most likely it was folk people who came up with the explanation early on, tried, because there really is that gap. Why Abraham? Why all of a sudden him? And that's a profound question, I think, for anybody who believes in this particular narrative, for anybody for whom it's essential. They would like to know what made this man special, not somebody else. Because we know what made Noah special, for example, a lot of them, but why Abraham?
Well, like the prophets that that are chosen. They're chosen because they're special people. And a prophet is a person that doesn't tell the future. He explains what God's all about to the people. Sometimes that may include future telling, but that's not what a prophet is. And so Abraham then became Abraham later when he had the children at the age of 100 or something like that, him and his wife. But he was a religious, devout man, a believer, and with few faults, I guess, like many of the prophets.
Just imagine that this story were true, and this high status idol maker, a part of with relationships to the high priestess of Ur, and all these important political and religious figures, suddenly gets destroyed, and his child, or they suggested he may be as old as 65 at that point, but his offspring denies the whole basis of their society. And you see why Abram at that time would have been a hated character, someone that had to flee. And it's quite conceivable that it happened in some form of this. I mean, obviously this has been almost written as a comedy, but if something like that happened, it could be one of those little events that really changed the world.
And in this story, Abraham's the one that discovers that these idols that people are making, statues, aren't actually God at all, because they can't do anything. They sink in the river, they get burnt up and whatnot. And of course, Abraham later hears the voice of the real being, that and so he becomes a believer, at that point, and realizing that the statues are nothing.
Well, and I would like to add to this. So we're asking this question: why Abram? Why Abraham? But here we are talking about him today, and so there it is. It's like, so this individual was chosen, if you will, for that reason. He had those qualities that we are speaking his name today, and we're talking about him today and his legacy today.
Right. And he founded so many different tribes, for lack of
Homicidal sex.
And his name is, when you talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I mean, he's one of the big three.
Right. But, it's interesting, and I don't mean to offend the feelings of anybody who is religious here, but I mean, if we look at the story, let's say for a minute, just as a way of speculation, a totally non-historical way, but if we for a minute imagine that this is an actual account of something that may have happened, and if we leave all the kind of the supernatural, the spirit, the divine interference. I mean, let's say that you are the son of somebody who day in and day out makes these statues, right? And familiarity tends to breed contempt. And you have all these experiences, and then a natural disaster happens, and your father's house is struck and burned away. Do you really need to hear a voice in your head at that point in time, after thoughts like that, to maybe think that, maybe I'm right and they're wrong? I mean, to me, it seems like an event like that would be enough to push forth a religion, to push forth a whole different way of looking at things.
But he's just the one guy, though, trying to convince other people of an idea that's different. That's what prophets did. They tried to steer people back on the right path, but it was always different. I mean, even Jesus said that, like, the prophet is not welcome in his own house. They come into trouble all the time.
Right. And it's implied kind of in the story that the reason why his father was actually struck down was not because he was worshiping multiple gods. That wasn't the issue, because according to the story back then, nobody really knew that there was just a single God. Abraham was the first one who came to that concept. So that was not the reason for the punishment. The reason for the punishment was the fact that he was multiplying and making these effigies, these figurines, these statues, and so forth. In other words, his offense was in perpetuating the ignorance of the masses. for lack of a better term.
Well, and what's also, and getting back to your earlier question regarding a specific angel, and a very similar, very profound event is attempted sacrifice of Isaac. And who was the specific angel who came down and prevented that sacrifice and showed Abram, the head of a ram, or or the ram that was caught in bushes.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring this up, because much like right about the point where I stopped, because I kind of wanted to stick to the simple and not complex part. But here's the thing, this whole, weird sacrifice of the animals. So what happens within this narrative is that Abraham, an angel comes, I'm simplifying the story ridiculously, but an angel comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, you need to do A, B, C, and then you can go up and talk to the Lord, right? And Abraham takes all these steps. Well, later on, when the demand comes upon Abraham to bring his child, he's not bringing his child. If you take this story at face value, then it means that what Abraham is doing with his kid, he's repeating the steps that he himself had already done some years previous and did not harm him in any way, shape, or form. In other words, an angel instructed him to do these things, and as a result of that, he went up and talked to the Lord. So now that he's instructed to do the same things with his kid, it's not really in his head that this is in any way a dangerous undertaking. Am I making sense? And that also explains that gap in the story. Because that is, I'm sure that's something that disturbed people 70 AD as much as it disturbs readers today. I mean, that moment of the child sacrifice and the actual cultural and historical and religious backgrounds of the rituals that actually, echo in that story have long been since forgotten, even in 70 AD. But the explanation was kind of engineered. Look, Abraham has done this with himself. It was perfectly safe. So he wasn't really sacrificing his child. He was sending his child up to God. Which of the children it was is a big fat question, according to what faith you happen to be of.
The underlying message of that story was he was willing to do that. And he had faith that there would be intervention.
But that's the traditional interpretation, because in the traditional interpretation, he's looking at this as he's been asked to sacrifice his child, where in this particular narrative, it's interpreted as he's been asked to take his child up the staircase that leads the child from point A to point B that he himself has already walked, so it's not a dangerous thing. That's what I'm trying to say. So it puts a whole different slant on that whole episode.
And one of the disadvantages we have as Christians is we don't have access to the midrashes or other explanations of what's going on in the Jewish scripture, which Jews have and they rely on. They don't treat them as scripture in the same way as the scriptural, the canonical texts, but they do fit gaps, and things like that, like Abraham doing with his son just what he did himself. So yeah, it's no big deal. You're quite right, but we don't see that as Christians reading only Abraham.
Right. And so upon that, then Christian scholars over the centuries built all these different explanations, for example, like the symbols of like the four-headed figures and so forth. I mean, sometimes it's just a mistranslation of a word. Sometimes it is a symbol that has long since been lost. But very, like the number 666, for example, where very complex meanings get piled on top of it, when in fact it's just the coded name of one specific political figure, So, or, the whole rant, basically the whole text is really talking about specific political situation at this time and place, and not something that's going to happen in sometime later on in unknown time.
Yeah, about 90% of Revelation had already happened by the time John wrote the thing.
Right. Oh, yeah, pretty much. I mean, he was
history. Yeah.
Basically, he was shouting revolution, revolution. And the funny part is that there was so many different similar religions, right? Or, I mean, because we even in the remaining text we have, pardon me to anybody who believes that I'm committing a sin, but there's the idea of Yahweh, but also there's the El, all the angelic names we have, even in the name of the nation Israel, Azazel, Michael, Raphael, El, but those are two different deities from two different cultures in all actuality. And even the word Baal, which is oftentimes is vilified, even in the Old Testament, it's nothing but the word Lord, really. It's not a name of a god. It's not not even a deity's moniker. It's literally a term of the same word as we use when we say the Lord. It's because there's Baal here, Baal there, Baal of this kind, Baal of that kind, and my overseer, the Baal. These monotheistic, remember when we're talking about the Assyrians, how this monotheistic tendency seems to be kind of part of the Semitic mentality in a way. They had Asher, for example, the Syrians did. And it seems like these ideas were popping up in this area because you have an altar here, an altar there, but they all dedicated to a single God. Now, not all knowing God yet. It's a God that's a single God to this tribe. Kind of, my God is better than your God. But gradually that idea emerges into kind of a singular deity.
That whole idea of this monotheism, as most scientists or people that take an empirical kind of approach, is the idea that monotheism is evolving. It's you have the Ashers, you have the Zoroastrianism coming in later. Yeah, that's more of a dualism, but that they're synthesizing into these great three monotheistic religions that will have such influence on the world. But there's a process going on here, a blending. There may well be divinity in that process, but it's happened. That's hard to prove, but it seems like that with like the Syrians, you are getting these. They recognize other people's gods. Y'all can keep worshiping. Just send us our tribute. But they give a precedent, and there's many examples of that. And then what's the Zoroaster god? The main god? Yeah, Hormuzda.
But that's a different concept.
Yeah, but there's almost a move towards that. But it was still, as the story suggests, it's still a radical departure that Abram made.
I've got a thought on that, if you don't mind me jumping in real
Please
quick.
do. This is kind of what we're doing here. Not so much having a historical thing. It's just kind of a discussion, really.
Well, it has been suggested to me in the past that people may actually move more into a single symbol to, unify them, such as, we have Jesus and we have, Muslim prophet. And then before that, we would have these other monotheistic figures, kind of like we had kings, emperors, that type of thing. It might just be that it's easier for people to make sense of their life if they have a single symbol to pour everything into. And maybe that was very attractive, especially when you compared it to certain alternatives, like, well, you had the polytheistic, Greek gods and goddesses. They were very petty, not easy to get along with often. Then later on, you had, Manichaeism, the duality of dark and light. So maybe these things just made a lot of sense to people and they caught on very quickly.
And that is something that's been argued, especially when you have centralization of power. I mean, and there's a lot of examples where people convert, for example, to Christianity or other monotheistic religions because the persons in authority kind of have the idea of one God, one ruler sort of thing. But then as soon as they move into this kind of thing, you have a situation when you have Protestants versus Catholics in Europe, riding into battle with each other, screaming, my Jesus will beat your Jesus. Or you start, offering sacrifices to different images of Madonna, as you do in Slavic tradition, where you have Kazan Madonna, you have Rizan Madonna, and people treat them as if they're different persons. They're not the different images of the same Madonna. They're not the same different images of the same Mother of God. They're different people. They're different gods.
That's one of the problems we have these days by not studying theology. The seminary I went to had Anglicans, and it's mostly Catholic, and they also had Eastern Studies, which is usually Ukrainian Catholic, but a lot of Orthodox as well. And we all had the same professors and the same courses. It turns out we're all 98% the same. Mm-hmm. So, the Orthodox, Anglican, Catholic, and we're basically tiny, tiny little differences in practice, but not in belief. And so a lot of people don't realize that, like the Catholic Protestant thing. I mean, we're basically the same.
Right. That's why it was for the longest time believed that people of the book, whether it's Judaic, it's Muslim, whatever. But then it breaks down into this kind of like my version versus your version, and then you start having multiple Christs and multiple Marys and multiple whatever else.
Human additions to the religion that, I mean, in my belief anyway, represent what God, who's actually there. And we, I'm an Anglican, so I worship in an Anglican way, but I don't think Catholics are wrong. I don't think Muslims are wrong. They just have a different approach, but it's the same God.
Right. And who breaks it down?
The people.
People break it down, or do the rulers, the people in charge, break it down?
In our seminary, I say it was specifically done, and we had to write a report on a significant figure of the other side. Like the Anglicans had to write about Catholics, and Catholics had to write about an Anglican as an example. So that it was encouraging that diversity in that all in one.
Originally, when the Russian scripture was translated from Greek, it was translated a very long time ago, and people who were translating it, it's been a long time, a lot of mistakes accumulated. People did not really understand the language very well back then. So people have been worshiping and doing their rituals according to certain canon that was not accurate to the Byzantine canon that they were trying to learn from. So a very enlightened church leader came in, and then he retranslated all the scriptures, and he corrected the rituals to match what was supposed to be done in the first place. I mean, the main difference was this: do you cross yourself with 2 fingers? Minute, itty bitty differences. Do you sit or do you stand during this particular ritual? Do you say this word that way or this way? This caused, I mean, when you hear about people, families being found in Siberia hiding out from authorities today, still sometimes, that caused the rift in the Russian Orthodox Church that has never healed. And that was not coming from above. From above, they were trying to unify, to enlighten, but the people said, no, what you're offering us is satanic. It's evil. They ran, they like en masse. I mean, they would set themselves on fire or bury their whole villages. They would bury themselves alive rather than switch from crossing themselves with 2 to 3 fingers. So I think a lot of it comes from people's real, I think what it is people's habits, the rituals. I think it's people's mixing up, not even mixing up, the people, sometimes it's the rituals outweigh the content, or the form outweighs the content, if that makes sense.
As a magical thing, and that crossing yourself a certain way has power. If you do it wrong, you don't have the power. There is power there, yes, but it's not 2 fingers, 3 fingers, or your whole hand. That actually makes no difference.
But when a couple million people died for the right to do it this way, not that way, does that give it less or more power?
Like and we did a Lenten study series in the church I was going to in Ottawa, because we had a Hindu temple in our parish, and we went to visit them, and they said Hindus have one God. I'm like, what? What about all the other gods? They're just avatars of God, and they think Jesus is just another avatar of God. So they have one God, which was quite a surprise. And now, so we Christians and Hindus are the same in having one God. After that, things diverge pretty quickly, but fundamentally we're all the same.
Never mind that the gods are slightly different. But sorry, just since you brought up the Hindu temple, just a really quick funny story. So I know a person who lives in Thailand. They're Russian, but they live in Thailand. And so in Thailand, you can become a Buddhist monk. It's just a part because you want to do it for a while, or you want to improve your karma, or you want to improve the karma of a deceased relative. Anyway, he decided to do a period of time as a monk, and he went into a Buddhist monastery. By the way, they're monks also, they're shamans. It's normal for a monk to be the shaman at the same time. But he went into the monastery, and he got assigned his cell and everything else. And at some point in time around Christmas, other monks came to him and they said, hey, brother, we found out that you are from Russia. And we hear that you in Russia are Russian Orthodox, and from what we understand, it's your holiday. So do you need some sort of special symbols to celebrate the holiday? Would you like us to bring in a cross and hang it on your wall? I don't know. I wanted to have this discussion because I just thought would be a fun way for me to get back into talking about things. And
there's yellow robe Buddhists and orange robe Buddhists, and they don't get along. But Buddhist is not. It's actually a philosophy, not a religion. They can believe in lots of gods, one God, or no God at all. And they have a different approach to the idea of gods and things.
Except that in Thailand, Buddhism is a religion. Moreover, it is a polytheistic religion.
Right.
Yeah, but that's actually a philosophy.
No, I
Strictly
understand that, but they practice it as a religion.
but it's a philosophy that's just practiced as a religion. You're quite right.
Yeah, I have a question for you, actually, Chris. Didn't you mention that Native Americans in the areas that you live actually converted to Christianity fairly easily?
Oh, very easy. The Gwich'in are the people north of where I am, and they're Athabascans, the same as Yahtzee actually. But they accepted Christianity very quickly. The Toronto Gwich'in, the people where I live, they accepted Christianity relatively well as well. But it was the Gwich'in story was an amazing story for the missionaries that came.
But they do keep their old traditions and their old rituals, right?
Well, I don't know. My ex was a Gwich'in, and she was not a Christian when I met her, and she became a Christian after meeting me. Actually, Dad suggesting that she do this. That she called God Dad, and she meant it. But she said for her, going to Christianity was like going from watching a movie in black and white to watching a movie in color. It's the same stuff. It's just a little bit added.
When Constantine allegedly converted, whether that was Saul of Leviticus seen as a Christian god or whatever, it was largely political. But he promised tolerance. Well, that tolerance lasted 37 years.
After he was gone, it became politically expedient to become a Christian, even if you weren't.
And to not be a pagan.
A lot of the actual teachings were lost because it was, you called yourself a Christian without actually doing the Christian stuff.
And by 50 years later, Julian the Apostolate was condemned left and right, and he was a good emperor, but until he went to battle without his armor. But anyway, it's just the assumption that the way all people are ethnocentric. So if it's a natural thing to think my religion's right because it makes sense in my world, but
but
we hope we're a little more open-minded than that.
Yeah, but I know it's not the only way. Like when my daughter was baptized, one of her godmothers was a Jewish lady who was actually turned out to be an excellent godmother, but she's not even Jewish. And we asked about that, and the archdeacon said, yeah, as long as you've got a Christian one as well, no problem. And so there are people out there that are quite enlightened, but mostly the people that are educated in theology, and most people are not. But most people know very, very little.
Yeah, my background is more, there is a political, religious history behind, the conversion process, even in my time period. But basically, from what I understand, it's the power of God that moves through everything to bring everything to life, including even our Navajo deities, even duality. Duality is part of existence. We have the two extremes, but there's a recognition that the two extremes have to blend together. It can't be a one or the other because that's out of balance. And when that's out of balance, then it causes conflict. So when you get this dual extremist perspective, it's either one or the other, then conflict going to arise. So they have to blend to find this harmony. So there is a dualistic philosophy within the Navajo religious system. And I think I kind of see it when I look at, let's say, in Anna, like the old goddess in Anna, because she kind of like symbolizes duality, the god of love and war.
Right.
This idea.
There's no good or bad. It's always complex. It's always, I have this saying that reality is complex, multi-layered, and fluid, and everything can exist at the same time. It's a question of how many layers you're willing to see, how many layers you're open to perceiving. They all exist regardless of you. Not just in a Navajo culture or some other cultures that later encounter the European civilization, or even in Russia, where on the one hand the elites converted, I wouldn't say willingly, but I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about the conversion of Rus, but you know, Vladimir, the original Rus lord who wanted to convert, he wanted everybody to march to the same tune. So first he gathered all the most prominent pagan gods from the nearby villages and tried to create a Greek-like pantheon of these total, you know, various gods. Well, that lasted for a minute, but people did not take to it. And then he talked to the Byzantine people, simplifying, and found out that there's the idea of a single god. And he was like, okay, let's do monotheism. Let's do monotheism. Everybody converts today. But he only, because Russia is big and there's a lot of forests, and he only converted the elite. And so for the longest time, heck, even today, I was talking to Nathan about it the other day, you know, the idea that Russian Orthodox monks oftentimes will go outside the monastery gates and feed the pigeons as a part of a religious practice. Well, that's a pagan practice, people. I mean, they talk it to the souls of the dead. That's what you do. And when they ask, well, why do you do this? How does the church explain that? They say, well, you know, not all people are buried within the Christian cemetery. And there are people who committed suicide or otherwise did not get the proper burial. And it brings the solace to their souls and the souls of their relatives to feed their souls as they come to visit us. And it's always that there's no such thing really as pure Christianity unless you're some philosopher, dogmatic, or pure anything. It's always kind of a merge of different cultures. Even in Islam, even in the most radical Islam, there's still vestiges of that those early Arabic religions and so forth. So I just think it's a fascinating subject, but I kind of wanted to talk about something that would be a little bit easier to talk about, right? Very simple.
I think that this was actually
Just opening a
topic.
Opening a kind of
Thank
worms
you.
of a different flavor.
Yes.
Right. Well, and plus, you know, I mean, because like when we're talking about other cultures, I mean, Japan, you know, which is still, you know, very much basically spiritual, you know, it's kind of shamanism. I mean, not kind of, is shamanism, an official state religion. Or China, where, you know, they have multiple state religions, some of which are not religions. Or India, so on and so forth. When you have layers of religion, it's important to remember that that's also present in our culture. Even in Protestant culture, you know, originally the whole idea of Protestant movement was to get rid of all this mystical stuff, get rid of the magic, as you mentioned, Chris, and to make it pure logic. Well, but what do you do if you have somebody who's possessed? You run around and look for Catholic priest, which was pretty common at the time in certain areas. Because, yeah, now I'm a Protestant and I don't believe in none of this nonsense, but what if there's a vampire in the village? We need a Catholic priest because the Catholic priests, they have the magic. And that magic...
Like hocus pocus comes from hoc est corpus est, which is the body of Christ. That's literally what it's in Latin. It's what it means. It became hocus pocus, which is a magic word, because turning the bread into God was magic.
Right.
You know, what I always liked, for example, about Russian Orthodox churches, because they still do the service in the archaic Slavic, what they call the Church Slavic, which is kind of old Bulgarian language. And so, I mean, and plus we all, meaning my generation, come from basically a state of affairs when the state and the church was separated from each other, you know, and only the cool kids snuck out on Sunday to go to a ruined church and attend a service because it was a risque thing to do, you know. We were never, my mom tells me that my family is Christian, and I'm like, yes, Mom, except you don't know how to properly cross yourself. And I saw a Bible for the first time in the children's rendition at the age of 14. But, okay, we're Christian. But what I'm saying is that to all of us, that there's the magic, because they sing, there's not really, you know, preaching in the way that there is even in Catholic Church. It's all in the sing-song and language that you kind of almost understand, but not quite. And the magic is there, and that magic is what, to me, is the most compelling part of the ceremony. The moment I go to Greek Orthodox Church where they're speaking plain English and I understand what they're saying, I'm like, okay. So I think it's important to have a little bit of that mystery, a little bit of that wonder, a little bit of that magic, to have people's eyes light up and believe in that miracle, believe in something. It's like believing in Santa Claus at Christmas almost. People need a little bit of that hope.
They do, because how else are you go? If there's no magic, how can you take a leap of faith?
Right. Then becomes dogma. Then becomes nothing but dogma. And dogma becomes political and dry.
And a little bit of wonder is always welcome. And on that note, by the way, Julie, I do enjoy your outfit. And imagine what you would look like if you were running at 100 miles an hour. A gray blur. You wouldn't see the black and white. You'd see a gray blur.
Well,
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Ryan. Love the hat, Julie.
thank you. That's called I Need a Haircut. But anyway, guys, thank you. This was a kind of an interesting discussion. I just figured that harass everyone was kind of not very. It's a known story, but it's really not discussed enough. And I think it's just those little apocryphal explanations to things we don't understand sometimes are very helpful for most people to understand. Those questions that kids ask in the Bible school all the time, And I answer.
Non-canonical is very difficult, Julie, and I'm glad that you bit this off because I think that it was a great way.
In terms of political, religious history, right after the Second World War, a lot of the Navajo kids were taken off the reservation and sent to boarding schools. And when that happened, the religious knowledge, the ceremonies were not passed to the younger people. But what the younger people experienced, they came in contact with people who are Native Americans who were part of what we call the Native American Church. And they brought peyote, that peyote religion, to the Navajo culture. And I remember talking to an old medicine man, and he says that he used peyote in he kind of blended peyote with Navajo ceremonialism. And some strict Navajos will say that's not right. But he said he did that because the kids did not believe in the Navajo ceremonial system. But if they took the peyote, it kind of gave them that mystical connection to allow that belief in the Navajo ceremonial system to work. And so I think to connect to that magic, you have to believe in it at some level. And so I think that's where you have this battle over 3 fingers or 2 fingers, because a person believes that, this is the way they do it, or this is the way they do it. But if they don't think it's the way they do it, then it kind of cuts them off from that connection to the Creator.
For the people with 1 or 2, 2 or 3 fingers, it becomes a question. This is how my father did it, how my grandfather did it.
Yeah.
It becomes more of an ancestral. Don't question my heritage. Don't question my ancestors. It almost becomes like kind of deference to the ancestral worship. But I think the interesting thing about what you said about peyote, that makes me think about another Russian folklorist who came up with this idea when she was young, and she now totally throws it away. But I think it's a good idea. How in more traditional, archaic society, when everybody in society believes, that energy almost enables the ritual to work. But when you're in a society when even one person doesn't believe, let alone 2, 3, 4, 5 majority, then the battery that powers that ceremony is no longer there. And so you need that artificial fuel to kick that magic in. Am I making sense?
Yeah. And that's
Absolutely.
well, to me, that power is always there.
Right, but people
Whether
don't
you
tap into
allow it to
anymore.
move through you or not.
Right.
Growing up, I shot competitive archery, and a very good a fellow that I shot competitive archery, Dan. He was one of those kids that you spoke of. He was taken off the reservation and sent off to a boarding school, and he told me stories of that, and it's pretty horrific. So, but he himself grew very, very good friend of mine.
Yeah. That was an interesting time period after the Second World War, even leading up into it. Okay.
I can tell you lots of stories about the residential schools in Canada. Like my ex was one, and she called herself a survivor, and she meant it. She was the only one of 8 children that survived the school. So, yeah, we have a bad experience for that in Canada. So people point to the religion, saying it was the religion that was bad. It wasn't the religion; it was the people doing it.
It was the society, the time period, the socioeconomic situation, and everything else. Yeah. Can I tell them the story about your dad?
Absolutely.
So David's father, I don't know how many of you know, but while I was in the hospital recovering, actually, as I came back from my surgery, David's father was hospitalized, and unfortunately, he passed away about a week and a half later. And it's a whole long story. But a couple of days ago, when was it? A couple of days ago, David got a phone call from his father. The phone rang, and it was his dad's number. And he didn't happen to answer the phone. He tried calling back. Of course, nobody picked up. So he called his son, who was at the house at the time, and he said, "Did you call me from dad's phone?" And his son was like, "No." And then he said, "Well, where's it at?" And his son wanted to go take a look, and he looked at the phone and he said, sure as heck, there was an outgoing call. So there's still magic in this world of all kinds, I think.
You don't hear about that every day.
Some other little thing.
And there was some other little things, but I think that there's a lot more. The other side comes through to us a lot more than modern rational society oftentimes allows us, or we want to admit even ourselves. So, but I think on that note, and we're going to try to we're just going to go back, do some more China, and then I really want to jump to Peloponnesian Wars and drive you insane with Peloponnesian War biographies, because there's just some. I want to talk about democracy and how great democracy is, and how effective democracy is, and how democratic democracy is, and how much Athens loved their democracy.
Especially the oligarchs.
Yeah, especially when they decided to vote themselves back into oligarchy, because the democracy they were tired of democracy to death. But yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for being patient with me. It's so good to see everyone. It's so good to be here. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys on the 15th.
Everybody be well.
You too. Bye, guys. Bye.
Good to
Okay,
see you
see
all.
you guys later.
Especially
Bye.
David and Chris and Julie, everybody. I hope to see you in 2 weeks.
See you then. Okay. Bye, everybody. Bye.
All right, goodbye.
As our legends unfold, we are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.